There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We drag them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. Beatrix Dane lives a life of suffocating silence, haunted by the memory of a mother she never knew. But a letter from a distant land is about to reveal that some family secrets aren't just buried, they are cursed, and they are waiting. The world of Beatrix Dane was a world of suffocating silence. She lived her life within the grand, gloomy walls of Blackwood Manor, an estate that seemed to have been built not from stone and timber, but from secrets and sorrow. The house stood in a perpetual state of twilight, its tall, narrow windows choked with ivy, its long corridors steeped in a permanent, chilling dusk. The air inside was heavy and still, thick with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and unspoken words. It was a house that held its breath, and Beatrix had learned from a very young age to hold hers as well. The master of this silent kingdom was her father, a man who was more of a spectre than a parent. Mr. Dane was a tall, gaunt figure who drifted through the echoing halls of the manor like a ghost in his own home. His face was a mask of stern, impenetrable grief, his eyes holding a deep, haunted look that never seemed to focus on the present. He spoke only when necessary, his voice a low, dry rustle of words that were as brittle as autumn leaves. His presence was a constant, oppressive weight, a source of chilling authority that demanded nothing but absolute, unquestioning silence from his only daughter. And the heart of that silence, the great, unspoken void around which their entire lives revolved, was the memory of Beatrix's mother. Beatrix had no memory of her. She had been told, in her father's clipped, emotionless tones, that her mother had died shortly after childbirth, a fragile soul too delicate for the world. Her name was never mentioned. There were no portraits of her hanging on the walls, no treasured keepsakes left on display. It was as if she had been surgically excised from the family history, her existence a shameful secret that had to be buried under layers of silence and denial. Any question Beatrix had ever dared to ask about her had been met with a cold, terrifying finality. "We do not speak of her," her father would say, his voice like the closing of a tomb door, and so, Beatrix learned not to ask. She grew up a lonely, isolated child, her only companions the silent, disapproving portraits of her dour-faced ancestors that lined the grand staircase. She pieced together a vague, imaginary picture of her mother from the scraps of information she could glean from the furtive whispers of the older servants. They spoke of her as a beautiful, vibrant creature from a distant, sunnier land, a woman whose laughter had once filled the grim halls of Blackwood Manor before the house, and her husband had slowly crushed the life out of her. But these were just whispers, fragments of a story she was not allowed to know. For Beatrix, her mother was a ghost, a question mark, a profound and painful absence that defined her entire existence. She lived in a house built on secrets, and she was beginning to feel that she herself was the greatest secret of all. Her life was a predictable, monotonous routine of silent meals with her father, long, lonely walks through the manor's overgrown gardens, and endless hours spent in the dusty library, losing herself in books that told stories of other people's lives, lives filled with a warmth and connection she could only dream of. The oppressive quiet of the manor had become her normal, until the day the letter arrived. It came on a gray, drizzly afternoon, an afternoon like any other. Beatrix was in the morning room trying to read, when she heard the sound of the postman's horse on the gravel drive. A few minutes later, the old butler Withers entered the room, carrying a single, small silver tray. On the tray lay a single envelope. It was an act he performed every day, but today something was different. The butler's face, usually a mask of professional indifference, was pale, and his hand, as he held out the tray, trembled almost imperceptibly. At that exact moment, her father entered the room. He stopped dead in the doorway, his gaze locking onto the letter on the silver tray. All the color drained from his face, his usual stern composure shattered, replaced by a look of raw, naked panic. It was a look Beatrix had never seen on him before, and it terrified her. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice a harsh, strangled whisper. "The post, sir," the butler stammered, his eyes darting nervously between father and daughter. "Give it to me," Mr. Dane commanded, taking a step into the room. But Beatrix was faster, driven by an impulse she didn't understand. A sudden, desperate need to know what could possibly provoke such a reaction in her stone-faced father. She snatched the letter from the tray. Her father lunged for it, his hand outstretched, his face contorted in a mask of desperation. "Beatrix, no, you must not read that. Give it to me." His frantic, desperate reaction was all the confirmation she needed. This letter was about her mother. This small, sealed piece of paper held a truth so dangerous, so volatile, that her father was willing to physically stop her from seeing it. Clasping the letter to her chest, she backed away from him, her heart hammering. "No," she said, her own voice trembling but firm. "It's addressed to me. I will read it." For a moment, she thought he would strike her. His face was a storm of fury and fear. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the storm passed. He seemed to deflate, a wave of utter defeat washing over him. He stared at the letter in her hand as if it were a venomous snake. "You will regret this," he whispered, his voice hollow, and then he turned and strode from the room, leaving behind a silence that was now charged with a terrifying, electric energy. Beatrix stood there, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hand clutching the envelope. Her entire world had just shifted on its axis. The oppressive quiet she had known her whole life had been shattered, and in its place was a loud, screaming question. She looked down at the letter. It was addressed to Miss Beatrix Dane, Blackwood Manor. The handwriting was an elegant, spidery script, faded with time. But it was the postmark that made her heart stop. It was smudged and difficult to read, but the words were unmistakable. New Orleans. New Orleans. A place of warmth, and music, and life. A place as different from the cold, gray silence of Blackwood Manor as it was possible to be. It was the place, the servants had whispered, that her mother had come from. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax seal and unfolded the thin, brittle pages within. The letter was dated many years ago, and it was from someone who signed themselves only as, "Your mother's loving nurse, Adeline." The letter was not what she expected. It was not a message of comfort or a loving remembrance. It was a warning, and every word, every sentence, was a hammer blow that systematically destroyed the foundations of the life she had been told. The lies she had been fed for 17 years crumbled to dust as she read, replaced by a new and horrifying reality. She had always felt like a prisoner in her home, and the letter was about to hand her the key to her cell, only to reveal that the prison was far larger, and far more terrible, than she had ever imagined. This letter held the truth, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the truth was going to destroy her. Beatrix sank into a chair, the room seeming to tilt around her. Her father's panicked retreat, the foreign postmark, the trembling of her own hands it all faded into the background. Her entire universe had shrunk to the thin, brittle pages of the letter she held. The ink was faded, a pale brown against the yellowed paper, and the elegant, spidery script spoke of a time long past. The letter began with a simple, heartbreaking salutation. "My dearest Beatrix." The words, filled with a tenderness she had never known, brought a sudden, sharp sting to her eyes. This was a voice from her mother's world, a connection to the ghost who haunted her life, and she devoured the words, hungry for any scrap of truth. The letter was from a woman named Adeline, who explained that she had been her mother's nurse and confidant back in New Orleans, long before she had ever met Mr. Dane. She wrote that she had promised Beatrix's mother, a woman named Celeste, that if anything were to ever happen to her, she would one day try to contact her daughter. Adeline wrote that she was an old woman now, and felt she could not meet her maker with this silence still on her conscience. "There are things you must know," the letter continued. "Truths that have been cruelly kept from you. Your father is a man locked in fear, and his fear has built a prison around you. I pray this letter is the key." Then came the first of the letter's revelations, a sentence that struck Beatrix with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless. "My child, the first and most important thing you must know is this. Your mother did not die at Blackwood Manor. She did not die of a fever shortly after your birth. That is a lie, a cruel and twisted story fabricated to protect a terrible secret." Beatrix read the words again, and then a third time, her mind refusing to accept their meaning. Not dead, the entire foundation of her life, of her identity as a motherless child, was a lie. A cold, hollow feeling spread through her chest. If her mother hadn't died, then where was she? What had happened to her? The letter, as if sensing her frantic questions, provided the horrifying answer. "Your mother fled," Adeline wrote, her script seeming to tremble on the page. "She escaped Blackwood Manor in the dead of night, a few short years after you were born. She left you behind, my dear, and I know that must sound like a terrible act of abandonment, but you must understand. She did it because she believed she was saving you. She ran, not from her husband, and not from her duties, but from the house itself. She was escaping something at the Dane estate that she feared more than death. She came back here to me in New Orleans a terrified, broken woman. She was not running to a new life. She was running for her very soul. Fled. Escaped." The words conjured images of a desperate, frantic flight, of a woman so terrified that she would abandon her own infant child. What could possibly have instilled such terror in her? What darkness resided within the walls of Blackwood Manor that could drive a mother from her baby's side? The story she had been told, of a fragile woman succumbing to illness, was a peaceful, if tragic, fiction. The truth was a thing of violence and terror. Her mother hadn't faded away. She had been chased away. Beatrix's hands trembled, the paper rustling loudly in the silent room. She read on, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a desperate need to know more. The letter then began to explain the nature of her mother's fear, and the words shifted from a sad history to the chilling territory of a ghost story. Celeste tried to explain it to me, Adeline's letter continued, but it was difficult. It was not a thing of the rational world. She called it the shadow, a shadow that clings to the women of the Dane family. It was a darkness she felt had been waiting for her in that cold, gray house, an inheritance passed down through the generations. It was not an illness of the body, Celeste insisted, though your father's family, with their cold logic, tried to dismiss it as such. They called it melancholy, hysteria, the usual words men used to dismiss a woman's fear. But Celeste knew better. She knew it was a sickness of the soul. She called it the Dane curse. Curse. The word seemed to leap off the page. A piece of medieval superstition dropped into the cold, rational world her father had built. Beatrix had read of such things in the Gothic novels she devoured in the library. But those were stories, fantasies meant to thrill and entertain. To see the word written down in connection with her own family, her own blood, was deeply unsettling. The letter described how her mother had felt the curse slowly taking hold of her after Beatrix's birth. It had started subtly, a feeling of being constantly watched, a sense of profound isolation even when surrounded by people. It was a darkness that fed on her happiness, draining the color from her world and replacing it with a pervasive, gray misery. The letter then gave a more specific, more terrifying description of the curse's effects, and as Beatrix read the words, a chill of recognition snaked down her spine. The symptoms it described were horrifyingly familiar. The curse, as your mother described it, seeks to isolate its victim, Adeline wrote. It makes a woman a prisoner in her own home, in her own mind. Celeste told me she began to feel trapped within the walls of the manor, that the house itself felt like a living entity that was slowly suffocating her. She became fearful of her own reflection, claiming that the woman she saw in the mirrors was not always her. She spoke of seeing shadows move at the edge of her vision, of hearing whispers in empty hallways. The curse preys on the mind, turning familiar things into objects of terror. It makes you feel as though you are fading, becoming a ghost in your own life, until eventually, there is nothing left of you at all. A prisoner in her own home, a feeling of being watched, a house that felt like it was suffocating her. These were the exact feelings Beatrix had lived with her entire life, feelings she had always assumed were simply the product of her lonely, isolated upbringing. But what if they weren't? What if they were the first, faint stirrings of the same shadow that had consumed her mother? The idea was so monstrous, so terrifying, that she felt a wave of dizziness. She looked around the morning room, at the heavy, dark furniture and the rain-streaked windows, and for the first time, she saw it not as her home, but as a cage that had been built for her. The letter was nearing its end. The final paragraph was a direct, desperate plea, a warning that was aimed not at the past, but at Beatrix's immediate, terrifying future. Adeline's handwriting here was shaky, frantic, as if she were writing against time itself. I do not know what became of your mother in the end, the nurse confessed. She lived with me for a time, a ghost of her former self, and then one day she was gone. I do not know if the curse followed her here, or if she simply could not bear the pain of having left you behind. But I am writing to you now, Beatrix, for a specific and urgent reason. Your mother told me that the curse seems to lie dormant until a Dane woman comes of age and is of a certain disposition, sensitive, lonely, imaginative. But most importantly, she told me that for her, the shadow began to truly take hold of her in her 18th year. From your date of birth, I know that you are now approaching that same fateful age. I beg of you, my child, be on your guard. Do not trust the silence of that house. Do not trust the shadows. The curse that took your mother will now be looking for you. It is your inheritance. The letter ended there. Beatrix let the pages fall from her limp fingers. They drifted to the floor, scattering around her feet. Her 18th birthday was less than a month away. The room was silent, but for Beatrix, it was now screaming. Every word of the letter echoed in her mind. Her mother was not dead. She had fled a curse that targeted the women of her family, a curse that trapped them, haunted them, and made them fade away, and a curse that was now coming for her. The past was not the past. It was a living, breathing horror story, and she was its next chapter. The silence of Blackwood Manor was not empty. It was waiting. The shadows in the corners were not just shadows. They were watching. And the mother she had never known was not a peaceful memory. She was a ghostly, desperate warning. The letter had not been a key to her freedom. It was a death warrant. The letter lay scattered on the floor around Beatrix's chair, its brittle pages looking like fallen leaves from a dead tree. The truths they contained had acted like a poison, seeping into her and changing the very way she perceived the world. Blackwood Manor, which had always been a place of oppressive silence and melancholic loneliness, was now transformed. The silence was no longer empty. It was menacing. The loneliness was no longer a passive state. It was an active, predatory force. The house had ceased to be her home and had become her inheritance, a cursed stage upon which she was now the lead, unwilling actress. The vague, formless anxieties that had haunted the edges of her life now had a name: the Dane curse. And giving it a name did not lessen its power. It magnified it. Her first and most immediate enemy became the mirror. In her bedroom, a grand, cheerless room furnished with heavy, dark wood, stood a tall, oval-looking glass in a tarnished silver frame. It had been there her entire life, a silent, passive object she had used for the mundane tasks of brushing her hair or checking her appearance. Now it was an object of profound and terrifying fascination. The nurse's letter had spoken of her mother's fear of reflections, her claim that the woman in the glass was not always her. That idea took root in Beatrix's mind and grew with a terrifying speed. She found herself drawn to the mirror at all hours. She would stand before it, her heart pounding, and stare into her own reflection with a new, frantic intensity. She was searching for what, she wasn't entirely sure. A flicker of her mother's features in her own? A shadow in the eyes? A sign, any sign, that the curse was beginning its work on her? Her own face became a foreign landscape. The curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw, the color of her eyes all seemed to belong to someone else, a stranger who was wearing her skin. The reflection that looked back at her seemed to mock her, its expression subtly different from her own. When she felt fear, the girl in the glass looked calm. When she tried to smile, the reflection's smile seemed like a pained, joyless grimace. The mirror began to play tricks on her, or so she tried to tell herself. She would catch movement at the very edge of her vision, a ripple on the smooth surface of the glass, as if a stone had been dropped into a still pool. When she would turn to look directly, there was nothing. Sometimes, for a horrifying, split second, she would glance at the mirror and the face looking back would be older, sadder, its eyes filled with a weary terror that was not her own. The image would vanish in the blink of an eye, leaving her staring at her own pale, frightened face, her heart hammering against her ribs. She started to avoid the mirror, draping a shawl over it at night, but its presence dominated the room. Even when it was covered, she could feel it, a cold, watchful eye in the darkness, a silent portal to a world of terror she was desperately trying to deny. The mirror was no longer a reflection of her. It was a premonition. The night itself became a new source of torment. The moonlight, which she had once found beautiful and calming, was now an accomplice to the curse. Her bedroom window was large, and on clear nights, the moon would pour a cold, silvery light onto the floor, painting the room in stark shades of black and silver. The familiar shadows cast by the furniture, which had been her companions since childhood, now became monstrous. The tall, slender frame of the wardrobe became a gaunt, looming figure with outstretched arms. The pile of clothes on a chair would take on the shape of a hunched, waiting creature. The moonlight seemed to be a stage light, specifically designed to highlight the menacing shapes and deep, dark corners where anything could be hiding. She would lie awake for hours, her body rigid under the covers, her eyes wide open, watching. She would trace the slow, inexorable path of the moonlight across the floorboards, her ears straining against the silence of the house. She began to feel, with a certainty that defied all logic, that she was not alone. The feeling of being watched, a vague sense of unease she had always carried, now sharpened into a distinct and terrifying presence. It felt like someone was standing in the darkest corner of her room, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, standing perfectly still, and watching her with a cold, patient intensity. She never saw anything, but the feeling was so real, so powerful, that she would find herself holding her breath, waiting for a floorboard to creak, or for a shadow to detach itself from the wall and move towards her. Sleep, when it finally came, was no escape. It was filled with suffocating nightmares of being trapped in dark, endless corridors, of seeing her mother's terrified face in every mirror she passed. Her relationship with her father, already strained and cold, deteriorated into a silent war of fear and suspicion. After his initial, panicked outburst over the letter, he had retreated behind an even thicker wall of silence. But his silence was different now. It was no longer the stern, authoritative silence of a man in control. It was the terrified, guilty silence of a man who was hiding a monstrous secret. Beatrix, emboldened by the truths in the letter, tried to confront him. "I read the letter," she told him one evening, her voice trembling as they sat at opposite ends of the long, polished dining table. "I know she didn't die here. I know about the curse." Her father flinched as if she had struck him. He did not look at her. He stared down at his plate, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table. "You know nothing," he whispered, his voice hoarse with a mixture of anger and fear. "You have read the ramblings of a meddling old woman. There is no curse. Your mother was unwell. That is all." "Unwell?" She fled from this house in terror. She left her own child. "What did you do to her?" Beatrix pressed, her voice rising with a desperate need for answers. "Enough!" he roared, slamming his fist on the table. The plates and silverware jumped. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was a mask of pure, desperate terror. "You will not speak of this again. You will forget what you have read. For your own good, you must forget." He turned and fled the room, leaving Beatrix alone with the echoing silence and the undeniable proof of his fear. His terror was her confirmation. The curse was real, and he knew it. He wasn't protecting her from a lie. He was trying to protect her from a truth he was too cowardly to face. A few days later, she found him in the library, a room he rarely entered. He was standing before the fireplace, where a single, small portrait was hung, half hidden by a velvet curtain. It was the only image of his wife that remained in the house. It was a miniature, painted on ivory, showing a beautiful, dark-haired woman with sad, soulful eyes. Her father had his back to the door. His hand was outstretched, his fingers trembling, as if he wanted to touch the portrait but did not dare. He was whispering to it, his voice so low and full of anguish that Beatrix could barely make out the words. "Celeste," he murmured, "forgive me. I did not know how to save you, and now I do not know how to save her." He was not a cruel man, Beatrix realized in that moment. He was a terrified one, a weak man who had seen the curse take his wife and was now watching, helpless, as it came for his daughter. His silence was not malice. It was a cage of his own fear. The house itself seemed to be conspiring against her, its silence breaking in subtle, terrifying ways. She began to hear things. The whispers started first. Faint, sibilant sounds, like the rustle of a silk dress just on the other side of a closed door. She would throw the door open, only to find an empty, silent hallway. She would be sitting in the library, and she would hear a soft, sorrowful sigh that seemed to come from the chair opposite her. But the chair was always empty. The whispers grew, sometimes sounding like fragments of her own name, Beatrix, drawn out on the edge of the wind that rattled the window panes. The house was no longer a silent, passive container for her life. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was beginning to speak. It was whispering the secrets that her father refused to tell her. The secrets of the woman who had walked these same halls, who had heard these same whispers, who had felt the same creeping dread. The curse was not just coming for her. It was all around her. It was in the mirrors, in the moonlight, in her father's terrified eyes, and in the very stones of the house. It was a closing net, and Beatrix was standing in the center, waiting for it to finally be pulled tight. The days following the arrival of the letter bled into a long, sleepless nightmare. Beatrix existed in a state of heightened, nervous tension, a string stretched to its breaking point. The oppressive quiet of Blackwood Manor had become a constant, low-grade roar in her ears. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of the wind in the ivy outside her window, every shadow that moved in her peripheral vision was a potential threat, a sign that the curse was tightening its grip. She was a prisoner in a house that was actively trying to drive her mad, and the loneliness that had been her lifelong companion now felt like a prelude to her own erasure. The suspense became unbearable. The waiting, the not knowing, the feeling of being stalked by an invisible, inherited doom was a torment worse than any direct confrontation. One night, a ferocious storm descended upon the manor. The wind howled like a hungry wolf around the eaves, and rain lashed against the window panes in violent, angry sheets. The storm outside was a perfect mirror of the tempest raging within Beatrix's soul. She knew she could not endure another night of passive terror. She had to act. She had to face whatever was haunting her, even if it meant confirming her own damnation. Her focus, as always, returned to the source of her deepest dread, the tall, antique mirror in her bedroom. It stood silent and imposing against the far wall, its tarnished silver frame seeming to gleam with a cold, malevolent intelligence in the flashes of lightning that illuminated the room. Tonight she would not cover it. Tonight she would confront it. She felt a strange, fatalistic calm settle over her. If she was to be a victim of this curse, she would at least look her fate in the eye. She lit a single, tall candle and placed it on the dressing table in front of the mirror. Its small, steady flame seemed fragile and vulnerable against the raging storm outside. She took a deep breath, the cold air of the room filling her lungs, and walked until she was standing directly before the looking glass. The room behind her was a cavern of deep, shifting shadows, but her own reflection was cast in the warm, intimate glow of the candlelight. She looked pale, her eyes large and dark in her frightened face. For a long moment, she just stared, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I know you're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. The sound of her own voice in the empty room was a shock. It was an admission, a challenge. "I know you are listening." Her reflection stared back at her, its lips moving in perfect sync. Nothing happened. The face in the glass was her own. The room behind it was empty. She felt a flicker of foolishness. Was she just a frightened girl, letting an old woman's letter and a Gothic house prey on her imagination? But she couldn't let it go. The feeling of a presence was too strong. The memory of her father's terror was too real. She leaned closer to the mirror, her face just inches from the cold, smooth surface. She could feel a faint, inexplicable chill emanating from the glass. "Mother?" she whispered, the name feeling strange and foreign on her tongue. "The letter said you fled because you were afraid. It said you wanted to save me. If that's true, if you are here now, show me. Please, I am so afraid. Warn me." She spoke the words directly to her own reflection, a desperate prayer offered to a ghost she had never known. She stared into the eyes of the girl in the mirror, searching, pleading, and as she watched, something began to happen. It was subtle at first. The reflection of the candle flame beside her head seemed to waver, to stretch, its light becoming distorted and unnatural. Then her own reflection began to change. It was as if she were looking at an oil painting that was being slowly dissolved by turpentine. The sharp, clear lines of her own face began to soften and blur. The contours of her cheeks, the shape of her nose, the curve of her lips, they all started to waver, as if she were viewing her reflection through a sheet of moving water. The feeling of dizziness returned, and she had to place a hand on the dressing table to steady herself. She didn't blink, couldn't tear her eyes away. The face in the mirror was no longer her own. It was a fluid, shifting mask of features. Then, the watery image began to resolve itself, sharpening back into focus. But the face that stared back at her was not hers. It was similar, a ghostly echo of her own features, but undeniably different. The face was older, thinner, its structure more delicate. The eyes were the same color as hers, but they were filled with a profound, soul-deep sadness that she had never known. The mouth, which was her mouth, was now tighter, etched with lines of fear, as if it were holding back a silent scream. It was the face from the miniature portrait in the library. It was the face of her mother, Celeste. A gasp escaped Beatrix's lips, a small, choked sound of pure shock. The ghost was real, and it was in the mirror. It was not a reflection of a spirit standing behind her in the room. The space behind the spectral face was not her bedroom. It was a vague, misty, gray nothingness. The ghost was inside the mirror, looking out at her as if through a window. The mirror was its prison. Beatrix stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The face in the mirror watched her, its sad eyes following her every movement. This was it, the culmination of all her fears. The curse was real, and here was its proof. Its previous victim, trapped forever in a silver-gilt frame. She saw her own future staring back at her. This was what it meant to fade away, to become a prisoner in glass, able to watch the world but never touch it, never live in it, again. The apparition of her mother seemed to sense her terror. A look of desperate urgency crossed its spectral features. It pressed itself closer to the surface of the glass, its form wavering slightly. It raised a hand, a pale, translucent hand, and pressed it against the inside of the mirror. It was a gesture of heartbreaking tenderness, a mother trying to reach out and touch the child she had been forced to abandon. Beatrix could see the faint outline of her mother's palm against the glass, a ghostly handprint on the barrier that separated their worlds. Then the ghost's lips began to move. It formed words, but no sound came out. It was speaking to her, trying to communicate through the impenetrable wall of silence. Beatrix leaned forward again, her fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a desperate need to understand. She watched her mother's lips, her mind racing to decipher the silent message. The spectral lips formed a word, and then another. It was a short, simple phrase, but its meaning was a cataclysm. Beatrix read the words as clearly as if they had been shouted. They lied. They lied. The words hung in the air between them, a confirmation of all Beatrix's suspicions. Her father, his family, they had lied about everything. The ghost's face contorted in a mask of desperate love and fear. It seemed to be fighting against the very substance of the mirror, using all of its spectral energy to deliver its final, most important message. Its lips moved again, forming one single, clear, and terrible word. It was a word that was both a revelation of her mother's fate and a prophecy of her own. Trapped. The silent word was a thunderclap. Trapped. That was the curse. Not death, not madness, but this eternal, silent, helpless imprisonment within a looking glass, doomed to watch the world, and the lives of those you love, move on without you. Doomed to watch the curse you escaped claim your own daughter. At that moment, a brilliant, blinding flash of lightning lit up the sky, and a deafening crash of thunder shook the manor to its very foundations. The candle on the dressing table was extinguished by the shockwave, plunging the room into absolute, pitch-black darkness. Beatrix screamed. It was a raw, primal shriek of utter, mind-shattering terror, a sound torn from the deepest part of her soul. She scrambled backwards, away from the mirror, her legs tangling in a rug, and she fell hard onto the floor. She lay there in the darkness, sobbing, her body trembling uncontrollably. The ghost's beautiful, terrified face and its final, silent warning burned forever onto her mind. The storm raged on, but Beatrix no longer heard it. She could only hear the echo of that one, silent, terrible word. Trapped. The final page is turned, but the chill will linger long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and return for the next secret we unearth. The mirror holds the secret. Her mother is a ghostly prisoner, and the curse is not a sickness, but a cage. Beatrix is no longer just haunted by the past. She has been given a terrifying glimpse of her own inescapable future. What do you think the Dane family curse truly is? And what can Beatrix possibly do now that she knows she's fated to become trapped just like her mother? Let me know your theories below.